Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Still a little bit under the weather, as you can hear, asking for your kind indulgence on this point, and certainly hoping to be a little bit less raspy by next week. But we'll cross that bridge, I guess, when we come to it. Now, today is the 2nd of December, 2016, and we are in the process of taping the show here in the late afternoon in Washington, D.C. So this allows us to look out over this panoply of events. Start, as usual, with some news briefs featuring the Middle East, but also some stuff from Europe and a little bit of domestic. And we then want to go on to, well, the epistemological problems posed by the process of cabinet nomination and how these nominees are perceived. And, of course, perceived means perceived by public opinion. And I guess we have to talk about the lights and shadows of that process. Also, in terms of the analysis of why this election turned out the way it did, that will lead us to a consideration of the issues of false consciousness and alienation as they are posed by political behavior. Then on to a few passing references to Plato on the question of oligarchy and where it comes from and how an oligarchy behaves. And then in the second half, we are approaching the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. So we would like to, use that as a case in point, right? Use that as a case of false consciousness, if you will. And having looked at that and some related issues from that general time frame, the Wake Island story of late December 1941, and then the famous turkey shoot of U.S. freighters in the Atlantic from January to about May or June of 1942 by the U-boats and how that could happen. Finally, we'd like to say a couple of words about the relative merits of General George Patton, who comes out less eminent in the scale compared to General Douglas MacArthur, who is head and shoulders superior. And if you're going to make these comparisons to a soldier statesman, you have Ulysses S. Grant, to be sure, but then you have Douglas MacArthur. And, of course, Douglas MacArthur's father, interestingly enough, came out of the Army of Tennessee, Grant's original command, and the only Union Army or any other army in the Civil War which never lost a battle. So, struggling to make headway against the forces of Laryngitis, right, that famous Greek guerrilla commander. Let's just take a look at what's going on in the Middle East. Mosul and Aleppo, a tale of two cities, of course. The number of neighborhoods in northern or northeast Aleppo that have now been liberated by the Iraqi army has now reached 23. Just a couple of days ago, it was 19 neighborhoods. So you can see that this is moving along. It's not a blitzkrieg. It was never going to be one. And those who put out those expectations were certainly not realistic. So, 23 neighborhoods. And there's also an estimate of about 1,000 of these ISIS fighters have been removed from the scene. They have gone to their reward. And that, of course, means that if they started with 5,000, which is about the estimate, that about 20% of their troop strength has now been annihilated. So, with all of the necessary caveats and with all of the urgings to try to respect the civilian population and be humane and so forth. That's Mosul. Congratulations to the Iraqi army for doing that. And then we go to Aleppo. And in Aleppo, the word we've gotten during the week is that the hope of the Syrian forces, the Russian forces, the Hezbollah forces, the Iranian-backed militias from other places other than Lebanon, they are hoping to wrap up the Aleppo liberation campaign by the 20th of January. And, of course, that is important because that's the inauguration day, of course. And what I'm reading out of that is that there's not a great deal of confidence in what's going to come out of the next U.S. administration on the part of Syria, Russia, and so forth, right? They're hoping for the best, but they're also preparing for other alternatives. And one obvious one is to confront the new administration in whatever form it may appear, and we don't know yet, as a fait accompli. So not too much trust, right? Not too much mutual confidence going on there, right? We need to get some confidence-building measures going on. Now, another important one is the French election. I'd like to repeat again what I have found in decades of research, that when you're looking at politics of the last 100, 200 years, it's really interesting to see how many deep parallels there are between the United States and France. France and the United States are both republics, and this means a lot since the middle of the 19th century, anyway, for the French case. And that means that there are undoubtedly important parallels. So what we have over there is now the primary that was held, and I want to compliment those French reactionaries on the primary that they held, because they're more democratic than the U.S. Democratic Party, right? They gave you 7 candidates in a debate, free for all. They then gave you a first round of election, right? And you came out of that with 2. That was Juppé and Fillon now being the winner. And then you had a second round, right? Ballotage. So you had your second round of the elections, and Fillon has now won that. Now, who is Fillon? We told you this in advance, and we can simply repeat it. He is his ego ideal is Margaret Thatcher of Great Britain. So he is an anti-worker, anti-union ideologue. He's, as he says, he's an extreme liberal when it comes to free trade and stuff like this. He's all for free trade. And he wants to do things like lengthen the average work week to 48 hours. He wants you to have to work several more years before you can get your pension, and do other things which generally undermine the quality of life and represent forms of austerity. So very big on scaling back labor protections, downsizing the government. You remember in this contest, it was Fillon who said, fire 5,000 government workers, and Juppé said, no, that's too much. Just 200,000 will do it. So that was your choice among these people. The form was democratic, but the content certainly not. So Fillon, classed as center-right in France, I guess. That would mean Le Pen more extreme right. But you got to remember with Le Pen, this is a complex comparison between the two. Because with Marine Le Pen, you get the maintenance, the preservation of the social safety net. She does not want to lower the retirement age. I'm sorry, she does. She wants to lower. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Washington, D.C. Sorry for the poor sound quality, so to speak. I mean, mine. but we were looking at the coming now election in the springtime for the new president of France, right? François Hollande, bowing to destiny and inevitability, says that he will not be a candidate for re-election. Shows that he's a great realist, because he had very little chance. He was very unpopular. And the reason he's unpopular is called austerity. Austerity. Because he promised that he would lower unemployment, and he even said, if I have not defeated unemployment by the time the re-election comes up, then you shouldn't vote for me. I would have been a failed president. And I'm sorry, that's what it is. And he let himself be led around by unscrupulous advisors who were right-wing apostles of austerity. And maybe there were some other presidents who ought to look at this, right? If you let yourself be led around by the kind of austerity fanatics that you find in the Republican caucus in Congress, then maybe your hold on power will not be that long or that successful. But now, so Fillon, again, center-right, and then rather further on the right, according to this schema, we have Marine Le Pen, and we have her National Front. But the interesting thing with her is she, again, wants to defend the social safety net, lower the retirement age, right? And on the work week, the French law right now is 35 hours. Juppé said 38, and Fillon said 48. So they voted for 48, whereas Le Pen says 35. So vote yourself the status quo on that. With Le Pen, increased benefits for low-income households, preserve labor protections such as the 35-hour week, plus all those firings, plus a whole bunch of other stuff. So naturally, Le Pen also brings with her this xenophobic baggage, which makes her unpalatable. Even Bloomberg Business Week, which I'm quoting from, tells us that many working-class voters would be attracted by her economic program. But there's also a cultural dimension that in France, perhaps more than other places, there's a left-wing culture, and then there's the right-wing culture. And what they say here in the magazine, even though French workers may not like Fillon's free market economics, they may like the National Front, her party, and its anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and anti-European rhetoric even less. Le Pen wants to get out of the European Union, and will any leftists be interested in this kind of a program? So it's, in slightly different terms, it's another Hobson's choice. It's another damned if you do and damned if you don't, and the devil you know and the devil you might know even less. These factors are all there. So I don't know. We'll see if anybody's intervening with anything halfway serious, because that is a very important thing. So now we've also got in the U.S. just a couple of final commentaries on Pelosi, right? Pelosi got herself reelected as the minority leader of the Democrats in the House, and she defeated Congressman Ryan of Youngstown, Ohio, and it was about a 2-to-1 margin. So she did have 2/3 of the votes, as she said. But on the other hand, 1/3 of the votes is a lot of votes, and it shows that there is a desire for something different. The something different, we hasten to add here, means mass traction economic demands. Mass traction, class-based, anti-austerity economic demands. And it was for want of those that Mrs. Clinton found herself the loser in the election. She wanted to do everything about Trump's temperament. No, that's not enough. And therefore she soft-pedaled her own good points, right? Free college. Again, instead of that silly better together or stronger together or whatever she had, free college could have gone up there, or affordable childcare, but better free college. It says it all in 2 words and conveys that message of optimism. We'll talk in a minute about why this didn't happen, right? Because this is the whole hot stove leak here is going to be going on until the spring thaw. So we'll as I say, we intend to put up a short summary of the 10 or so reasons why this election turned out as it did. Okay, but now leaving the international scene behind, let's take a look at this cabinet. Not so much today in terms of the details, the various curriculum vitae of the various appointees. Some of them are mooted but not yet officially announced, and that will all become clearer as we get into further into December. But, of course, what we have seen is the revolt of the masses. The revolt of the masses, which has so often turned out to be a futile revolt. That is to say, the masses wish to register a protest, and they're right to do so. But the masses are still so much under the control of the ideology of the old order that the characteristic protest actions of the masses turn out not just to be futile, but actually exacerbate the situation. And I guess that's what we've had. People were fed up with the establishment. They wanted an outsider, not an insider. They didn't want a career politician. And they wanted somebody who would go to Washington and break up and smash up the old ways of doing things. And my answer to that, as you all know, was look at the Arab Spring and answer me, please, whether some of those people in Libya, I mean, assuming these are persons of goodwill, right? Of course, a lot of them are not. But if you go to Tunisia or Libya or whatever it was, you have to ask, were you sure that the change would be an improvement? Because that is really a big deal. To say, I want change, this is a change election, that is simply, that's like telegraphing out tonight that you're going to be duped. The question is, will the change be positive or negative? Surely that's got to be something. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It is the 2nd of December, 2016. And I want to remind you, of course, to keep up with all of these exciting developments day by day, practically hour by hour. There is now Monday through Thursday a daily program, which includes everything you hear here and, of course, much more. So it's every day, and it's available in the evenings, usually around 9, although it's a little bit flexible. So I would urge you to subscribe to that, right? Help me support my work, register a kind of support, and go there and subscribe. And it's modest, very, very reasonable prices. You pay a little more, you subscribe, you end up supporting the mass organizing that we do, and we do it, and we will do it. So this is AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv. So please go there and subscribe, and then listen in, obviously, and send us your input, because we do look to that to decide on some of the topics. So the revolt of the masses, and now we have, well, as far as I can see, I guess we have 2 to 3 Goldman Sachs appointees. And we have, another guy who is clearly from Wall Street and a billionaire. And we've also got, in the national security area, we've got the National Security Council chief. We've got the CIA director. And now it looks like we've got the boss of the Pentagon, who all demonstrate a profile which seems to be characterized by great hostility to Iran. And I'm always, what can I say, filled with sad irony when I have various kinds of leftists sending me newsletters, right? So an elderly leftist has sent me his newsletter, which I'm always interested to read. But he says, well, with the result of the U.S. election, it looks like the danger of general war has gotten to be less. Oh, my dear friend, there are many paths that lead to the precipice of World War III, and the U.S.-Russia relationship is surely the chief of them, but not the only one. And it's not the only one that can set the world on fire. So I would urge everybody to look at that question of the new administration and Iran and tell me if you don't share my deep concern about the past profile of antagonism that we can see in this incoming group of cabinet secretaries. The revolt of the masses. So it was a great hue and cry, right? It was great Sturm und Drang, storm and stress upon the stage. People said that they wanted to vote out the old order at any cost. And instead, it looks like Goldman Sachs has reasserted its control over the Treasury Department, right? Certainly one of them was Hank Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary when the world derivatives bubble blew up in the panic of 2008. And, we've seen plenty of other representatives of Goldman Sachs, right? Whether it was, Bob Rubin under Clinton, lots and lots. Goldman Sachs. So, there's also one in the White House, as people have noted. So, what has happened? And I would submit to you, this is now an epistemological problem, and there are two sides. One is, why didn't people see that this was the likely outcome? Why did they think that simply nodding, giving your vote to somebody who said that the main issue was insiders versus outsiders? Why was that a persuasive argument? And then what do you do about it? In other words, what's the rate at which this particular misconception might be brought back into conformity or congruity with reality? And when you think about this, it's a serious problem. One is certainly the problem of memory, and memory that adds up to something. We remember that Leibniz, the great philosopher of optimism, of the computer, of the steam engine, of calculus and philology, linguistic studies, and so much more. Leibniz had this saying, right? He said, we don't need the immediate mind. We don't need the momentary mind. We don't need mens momentania carens recordationem. The momentary mind, which is lacking in memory. And we just heard this morning, it was funny, the unemployment rate, 4.6%, and they pointed out that's the lowest since the middle of 2007. And what, pray tell, happened in 2007? Well, under the auspices of a Republican Party and a Republican administration, and a Congress, which was also not quite Republican, but had been in recent years. That was the last time the unemployment rate was as low as 4.6%. So it's like we're on a treadmill. I can think of many ways to describe this. Is it a labor of Sisyphus? Is it a labor of Sisyphus where you push the stone up the hill and then it rolls back down again? And then you've got to go back and get on board and push that stone up there. I'm also thinking of a poem which appeared, I think this is It's a 19th century text of dubious scientific value, but it's a brief poem. I think I'm forgetting the author, but he says in Italian, "We are tied to our pride, and we go around in eternal circles, always wandering and yet always here." So it's everything is new, but nothing is new, and therefore here's what we have. So you may be surprised to hear that under the reign of the outsiders and the anti-establishmentarians and all of these wonderful people, that the economic doctrine has now gone back approximately 35 years, right? We're now told that if you cut taxes, you will increase tax receipts. And of course, if you say, how is that possible? That's a lot of malarkey. They will tell you, wait a minute, you've got to use dynamic scoring. Dynamic scoring is the way to go. And then you'll see the magic of the tax cuts, which once those rich guys get that money in their pockets, they will go out and invest in plant and equipment, and they will hire workers. The labor market will improve, and the wealth will trickle down. This is supply-side economics. This is the economics of the Laffer curve. And, of course, you've heard it before. The most prominent time you heard it was under Ronald Reagan. And what he did with that was to triple the national debt. Now, tripling the national debt depends on what you did with the money. If you had to today, I don't think this is the best way. I'm for using Federal Reserve 0% 100 credit. But if you have to do it, you can triple the national debt. But you got to have some capital goods, capital improvements to show for it. I'll explain it more in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome. Still here in Washington, D.C., and we're talking about the revolt of the masses, which seems to have accomplished a kind of circular process. In other words, a kind of wandering through the woods to reemerge in the original clearing, where the clearing is the world of supply-side economics and essentially forms of political domination which are agreeable to billionaires with a B, and the average person gets very little out of this. So we're talking now about false consciousness. Now, just to wrap up the previous point, if you're going to triple the national debt, at the end of that process, you should have made capital investments that will allow you to have, the best rail infrastructure, road infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, electrical grids, water systems, docks, ports, locks, and all the rest of this. If you're making that kind of capital investment in your future, that can be fine. But if you're just paying the current expenditures, or worse, giving tax cuts to the wealthy, then you got nothing to show for it. And that was the problem with Obama's stimulus, that he, in his craven way, especially at the beginning of his term, he was extremely timid and cautious. He said, oh no, if the Republicans want tax cuts to be a stimulus, that is a tax, that's a stimulus too. Yeah, it's a stimulus of the type that has a very short-term effect. Remember, if you want to have a recovery, what do you have to do? You've got to revive the capital goods industry, not consumer goods. If the U.S. has 70 or 75% of the economy in consumer goods, that's bad. You don't want that. That's a sick economy. You want that to be a little bit less, and you want consumer goods to be more as a proportion. And if you have consumer goods more as a proportion, the absolute amounts for people in the consumer goods category will be bigger than they would be under this consumer-centered thing. So we're hearing all that stuff again, right? We're going around in circles in terms of doctrine, and the same old stuff, unbelievable, the same old stuff is being told, right? Remember, Dynamic scoring, people, dynamic scoring. So we're dealing with false consciousness. We are dealing with alienation. Now, these are somewhat unfamiliar concepts from, in some ways, German philosophy of the beginning of the 19th century. But you have to face the fact now that large numbers of people in the society are invested, their egos are invested in a rather extreme distortion of the way the world actually works and of their own position in it. And that is the alienation. In other words, Kant was always there to tell us that we can't see ourselves as we really are. That is, we, with our faculty of perception, we can't see the noumenon of each other. We can't see each other as we actually are, but we see it through various distortions. And I guess that points towards this concept, right? That you have the alienation, and then you have false consciousness growing out of that. Now, part of this is, are you able to perceive your own enlightened self-interest? And it often appears that many people are not. They just don't know. They cannot fathom what their own enlightened self-interest might be. I'm always reminded of this rather strident suburban woman who said, I want those illegals out of here. And some intelligent newsman asked her, but lady, if you get Social Security, do you? She said, yes, and I want to keep it. She said, don't you realize that those illegals, so-called, are the people that are paying in to your Social Security? And if you didn't have them, your Social Security under the present arrangements, which ought to be changed, but under the present arrangements, you wouldn't have any more Social Security pension. And she just had no answer to that. So I would compare it to what you have in a child, right? It's a fit. It's a fit of rage, certainly, or at least something like that, infantile anger. So the other problem we have is that a lot of people act according to determinism. Now, just a brief note about this, right? We want to talk about class. We got to talk about working class. When you're talking about class, you have to distinguish between the class in itself and the class for itself. Terminology is Hegelian, right? It's actually class in itself and class in and for itself. But just to make it a little bit shorter, it's the class in itself and the class for itself. So the class in itself is what you see every day. That you see workers, they're not aware that they're members of a class. They're not organized to understand the world as a class. Least of all are they organized to act as a socioeconomic class. And of course some people would say, but yeah, there are trade unions. Unfortunately, the trade unions do not accomplish the necessary tasks. They do not bring the average worker up to the level of going beyond alienation and false consciousness and seeing things in a qualitatively better and superior way. It doesn't work that way. So the goal has always been, if you're serious, is not to try to romanticize or mythologize workers as you see them in society under these fallen conditions that we have, right? In late imperialism or, the rule of the imperialist finance bourgeoisie out there. You have to understand that people have to undergo a transformation. They have to learn things. They have to see the world differently. Nothing mystical, no mumbo jumbo. Just learn things and see the world differently. And if you go down that road, you may arrive at the class for itself. So the class for itself would imply workers on a large basis, right? A really big country like, U.S. or China or Russia, and internationally in places like Europe, where the countries are now, really, in some cases, they're just too small to influence the course of the modern world. So you notice that there are two two of these poles, right? The class in itself and for itself, and how you get from one to the other is a matter of education. Now, leaders, right, the hundreds of thousands even, can learn from books. They can learn from lectures and things like this. But the class for itself, the hundreds of millions, has to learn through action. In other words, through setting up a series of set-piece battles in which certain people reveal what they really are, and then the workers go on. But the problems with this are quite obvious, right? What happened? Why can't we remember what happened 8 years ago, right? When Hank Paulson was presiding over the Sunday meeting at the New York Fed, and they were getting ready to not bail out Lehman Brothers and let it all go down. Who can remember that? Do people realize what has hit them? I have to warn you, the Republicans are now bringing forward a new revisionism on what happened in 2008. And as long as we had Occupy, I guess, and as long as we had Bernie, the idea was that the bankers had caused 2008. And so they did. Maybe these explanations from Occupy and Bernie were not that good, but they got the main things right. We're now going to be hearing from the Republican majorities in the Congress. We're going to say, wait a minute, there was this question subprime, and those in the left in it, poor people, not adjustable mortgage, they bear a share of the book if they're paying. They'll be back in a minute. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., reminding you to tune in every day, Monday through Thursday, to my other radio program, which is called The American System. And please find out more about that by going to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. So, we're puzzling about the role of false consciousness and alienation. And these are the questions which differentiate the working class in itself, what you see, fragmented, often at war with itself, betraying itself, workers often turning against other workers. There's no other way to put it. And not showing a long-term estimate of one's own enlightened self-interest, rather vulnerable to all kinds of suggestions. Right? Now, you remember, under Marx and Engels, the idea was that the industrial working class was supposed to be the vehicle, the vector, bringing the reform and modernization of society. And that it was because capitalism had created these huge factories and that workers had been subjected to quasi-military discipline inside them, that they learned the benefits of organization. They could often get organized because they were all in one place, and people could come and trade union organizers could come and organize them, and that therefore they would be obliged by the logic of history to become revolutionary. The idea was actually that the working class would be pauperized. It would be immiserated by the process of capitalist concentration, and that eventually certain forms of revolt would have to occur. And the early Marxists, they don't care very much about mentality, culture, things like this. They say that doesn't matter because it's going to be life or death, and you're going to be pushed over the edge. Now, this has not happened. And it was already clear, it was clear in the 1930s, it was even more clear in the 1950s, and couldn't be clearer than it is today, that the working class really does not qualify to be this vehicle of the social progress and transformation, at least not the class in itself. And of course, that should have been clear from the beginning. There were debates, they seem quaint today, in the 60s into the 70s, about how do you wake up the working class and make them fight for something decent? How do you get them to fight, say, against the Vietnam War, which was absolutely pointless, but which the working class felt was a patriotic duty. Many of them did anyway. So here we have those old fights in Students for a Democratic Society. And there you had people like Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers, right, Obama's neighbors there in the University of Chicago neighborhood, and they were the weathermen, and they say that the white working class are no good, they're racist, they're chauvinist, and the point is to defeat them, to smash them. But then there were others. There were people on the other side who said, no, you have to become a workerist. You have to begin imitating the habits of the working class. So that meant their strategy that turned out to be something they called colonization, right? And it would be you go and get a job in a factory and you talk to the workers there. What do you talk to them about? Well, you can't talk to them about Marx because they don't know anything about that. And you can't talk to them about, some other theories, right? Socialism or this kind of stuff, finance capital. So you've got to talk to them about baseball and football and basketball and hockey, depending on where you are and what the season is. So you were supposed to go and learn from the workers. This was the extreme workerist position, was that despite what you saw the workers doing, they really knew what needed to happen, and you needed to take that seriously and subordinate yourself to them. You needed to accept the leadership of the workers' vanguard. And if the workers' vanguard said, you got to root for the Yankees, then that was it. Or if it was the Dodgers, then this other group. You get the idea. There were somewhat more sophisticated explanations. The Frankfurt School said that workers had been integrated. They had been bought off with concessions, meaning a rising standard of living. The Frankfurt School also said they have been brought to this status of integration by manipulation. In other words, the elections, obviously, both in Germany and the United States, were manipulated. So there is no immediate answer to this question. Right? One question would be, how do you get the workers to do something better for themselves than what they've been doing? I think I have the beginnings of an answer to that. Or alternatively, is there some other group that might be more interested in this stuff? So, in other words, in the progressive reform of society, here's what I would say. Once again, we've got this list of 10 points. As I said, I'm going to write that up and post it because I can see the debates on cable television are going farther and farther away from any reality. The reason this election turned out the way it did was because of the severe lack of mass traction, class-based, anti-austerity economic demands. And instead, Mrs. Clinton made so many mistakes. Not going to Wisconsin, I think, is a piece of absolute folly, of just really unbelievable ineptitude. But also this idea that you could focus everything on demonizing Trump in the relatively mild terms she did, that his temperament was wrong. Well, that doesn't really mean anything. That's not a very radical critique. So therefore, she then focused everything on that. And when people said, that's not my problem, at least not the way they saw it, they'd say, my kid has to go to college, my wife needs medical care, we need to stop our house from being foreclosed on. What do you got for us? Come on, give us something. And, of course, Mrs. Clinton tended to have nothing. And the reason for this is the identity politics groups of the Democratic Party are organized as subsets, and they're organized around these relatively narrow niche demands. It often comes down to what are the rights and privileges of one identity politics group in its interaction with the other identity politics groups. And I think in the course of his campaign this week, Congressman Ryan of Youngstown, Ohio, right, challenging Pelosi, he got to the point of saying things which I think he was verging on reality, which was that you've got to have a uniting demand. In other words, again, I keep saying mass traction economic demands, a nationwide demand that represents the interests and the imagination of a very large part of the population. Look, under Roosevelt, right, what was the winning FDR coalition? Well, it was big city machines. It was labor unions at their strongest point. It was Black America, because Black America voted for somebody who was going to give them jobs under WPA and PWA, just like everybody else wanted them. There were some farmers. There were soldiers and people in the military. And you go down that list, and the South, right? Somehow this was left over structurally from the earlier times of the Democratic Party. So that was Roosevelt. We'll tell you the Republican alternative in a minute, and then perhaps propose what might happen today. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So the FDR coalition included, well, a clear majority of the country, and the Republican Southern strategy also dominated the Electoral College, right? That would be the South, white men, evangelical Christians, the elderly, college graduates, believe it or not, and so forth. And that dominated from 68 to 2008. And now there's a struggle to define what it is. Don't worry that this is the end of the world. This is, as I've argued before, comparable to what Carter did in 76, was to undertake a kind of an exceptional breakthrough against the tide of history, and it turned out chaotically. But you couldn't look at the Carter electoral map and say that's the map of the future. It was not. So not every electoral college result is the map of the future. And once again, rather than studying sociology, study Comey, study the New York FBI office, study the strangling wrecking of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Worry about the $3 billion that were contributed to one candidate by the mass media. Also, watch out for these third-party people, for Jill Stein and Gary Johnson. Now, Jill Stein, I have to say, Jill Stein's recounts are probably the best thing she's ever done in her life. And what I find is that people who have supported Jill Stein in doing things which were quite counterproductive, shall we say, are now attacking her when she finally does something good. And this is so ironic. So, Jill, if you turn up anything, let us know. On the other hand, I don't think you can build a perspective on this, right? This is sort of it's a symbolic gesture. And again, I have to stress, don't ever get the idea that Jill Stein is going to be the leader of any kind of politics in the years to come. I can't see how, given what she has now done. All right, let's take a case in point now. 75 years after Pearl Harbor. Let me say, first of all, those of you who are waiting for my book on the subject, please bear with me. I am doing research. You're going to hear some of it right now. It will be coming. Don't ask me when. I have to respond to political events, and I generally have. And that's one of the things that maybe makes some of this writing of mine a little bit more interesting, that it's rooted in various, real world problems. So, let's talk about Franklin D. Roosevelt, because I thought this was a good example. If you wanted to say, if you want to ask the question, who is the U.S. president who has done most for the American people, say, after Lincoln, right, in the 150 years since Abraham Lincoln, I think the selection would narrow down rapidly to a few, and out of those, Franklin D. Roosevelt would emerge. In other words, in terms of economic rights, in terms of winning the war against fascism on the battlefield, in terms of a modernization of American life, and avoiding the kinds of dictatorial solutions that emerged in other countries. I think it's Roosevelt. So you have to imagine Roosevelt is the most anti-fascist of all political leaders. You can look at, Daladier of France. You can look at Stanley Baldwin or later Chamberlain in Great Britain. You can look at many others, and you'll see that these are people who wanted to appease fascism, right? That was their policy. And appeasement means a kind of support. So Roosevelt escaped that. The United States, thanks to Roosevelt, is the only country, the only one that did not become fascist in the rigorous scientific sense that I am arguing, that did not ally with fascists such as the Soviet Union through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and did not engage in this sort of half support known as appeasement. So here we are. Roosevelt, greatest benefactor in domestic and international politics, right? Defeated unemployment during the year 1941 with Lend-Lease. He defeated unemployment and saved, to a certain degree, the British, the Soviets, the Chinese from collapse during 1941. So now that we're getting to the 75th anniversary, you turn on the various history channels, and what do you find? You find these crazy people arguing that Pearl Harbor was a conspiracy where the evil Roosevelt and his communist advisors, like Harry Hopkins, essentially sold out the U.S. military to try to get the U.S. into World War II, which was not necessary and not going to happen. And it was all designed to try to help Stalin out of his mess and to save the British imperialists and so forth. And I find this absolutely astounding. In other words, we're dealing with the same kind of false consciousness. And the kind of argument I'm trying to make now applies also to fake news. Why are people gullible to fake news? Well, there are many reasons, right? There are various platforms that are broadcasting fake news out into the world, be it in print, cable, internet, you name it, right? Instagram, anything you want. But there's also a question of intellectual tradition. In other words, your mind has got to be softened up to a certain point. And historically, in the United States, I am guaranteeing you that the Pearl Harbor mythology, Roosevelt provoked Japan, and Roosevelt betrayed Admiral Kimmel and Admiral Stark, General Short, and their commands, because he wanted to be absolutely sure that the U.S. got into to World War II. This stuff is, I am sorry, it is crazy. We have here, therefore, another one or two other questions. When you look at something like Pearl Harbor, it's a big event. So what do? Do you just carve out a very narrow area around Pearl Harbor as a topic and just bore in and home in on that? Or do you also have to look a little bit at the context and see if similar things were going on elsewhere? And I would say, first of all, do we have an example of an officer corps with a fairly modern military force that was subject to a surprise defeat in the first clash with the fascist forces? I think you do. It's not just Pearl Harbor. It's the fall of France, right? The whole French army, 100 divisions, sort of collapsed in the spring of 1940. So that would be something to compare, right? What forces were at work in each case. And each one can tell you something about it. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So, concerning Pearl Harbor, nearing the 75th anniversary, but also factoring in this question of the tremendous confusion in the American people, or at least a lot of them, is this problem of seeing Roosevelt as a villain. And it's so ironic, because if there's one person you could say was the key to winning the Second World War in the entire world, not just with the U.S. forces, important as they undoubtedly were, but also with Lend-Lease production and all the things, right, for which the Soviets and the British and Chiang Kai-shek of China thanked the United States. So how do you get the situation where the main anti-fascist turns out to be this monster? Well, there are these Roosevelt haters, right? There are these wealthy malefactors who have decided that Roosevelt is a villain. Roosevelt embodies communism. He wants to have a social safety net. He's concerned about workers. He betrayed his class. They have all these arguments. And therefore, they've got to find a way to blame this on Roosevelt. Now, the origin of it was the Republican presidential campaign of 1944 for Thomas E. Dewey, which Dewey duly lost. But they were going to, which Roosevelt lost. Which Dewey lost to Roosevelt, I'm trying to say. So it was a defeat for Dewey and the Republicans when they thought they could finally get back into power after 3 terms. But no, they couldn't. So that became then Roosevelt and Truman from 44 to 48. Another one you got to bear in mind is, we just said, are there examples around the time of 1941 of a first-class military command, what should have been a state-of-the-art military command, suddenly collapsing under an onslaught? Well, the French army would be one. And the other thing is, when you're dealing with Pearl Harbor, you're dealing with a problem of air defense. So what were the main examples of air defense, maybe successful, not successful, that you can learn from? To understand what went on at Pearl Harbor. And I have to mention in advance, there was this thing called the Dowding system. The Dowding system is what won the Battle of Britain. The Royal Air Force of the British had inferior numbers, maybe superior abilities, but certainly inferior numbers. And they were only able to prevail because of this system whereby all observational data, including the radar impulses of the Chain Home coastal radar system looking east from the east coast of the British Isles towards Germany, continental Europe, France, that was all funneled into one room at a place called Bentley Priory, not so far from London. And they had a big room. You might have seen these pictures. It's a big room with a huge table and a bunch of women pushing with what looked like pool cues, these markers around on the board, and each one represents a group of British or German planes. And if you were going to do serious air defense, everybody knew you had to study that. You had to imitate it. So the U.S. said, okay, we're going to have one for Boston, and they built it, and we're going to have one for New York, and we're going to build that too. And there were officers in Pearl Harbor, Army officers in particular, who were trained to set up such a filter room, which would have been the so-called information center or aircraft warning system. Now, very briefly, there are a bunch of levels. I guess we're going to have to do one level today and probably go on to some others. But 10 days before Pearl Harbor, right, just to make it all very clear, the Navy sent out a cable to General Short in Pearl Harbor, and it was also given to Admiral Kimmel. And it says, first thing it says, this dispatch is to be considered a war warning. This dispatch is to be considered a war warning. So 10 days before the attack, they tell him, watch out, war is coming. And he is told, execute an appropriate defensive diplomatic deployment, an appropriate defensive deployment preparatory to carrying out various tasks assigned to you in the war plans. Okay, so war is coming. Get yourself into a defensive deployment. Now, what part of that don't you understand? You got to do reconnaissance. Now, here's the an additional embroidery on this. It starts off saying, actually, this is the Army message as it was sent to the Navy. We might face unpredictable but hostile action possible at any moment. And then it goes on. You are directed to undertake such reconnaissance and other measures as you deem necessary. Now, once you've been told war is coming, watch out, defensive deployment, do reconnaissance, and so forth, that's the heart of the matter. And if you claim, oh, nobody told me after this is absurd. Yet that is the thesis of the people who want to blame Roosevelt for this whole thing. So therefore, you have to ask yourself, you're sitting in Hawaii. Oh, by the way, we should also point out, right, that there were other commands that got this, right? The West Coast Command in San Francisco got it. The Panama Canal Zone guy got it. And they write back all the things that they're doing to comply with this directive. And the guy from the Panama Canal Zone says, look, I am running my radar 24 hours a day. Radar had just been distributed to all of these commands. The only one where the response was lackadaisical, half-hearted, inadequate is Pearl Harbor. Not San Francisco, not the Canal Zone. And the Philippines, of course, flourishes from MacArthur, who turned out to have special problems. MacArthur's special problem, of course, is he's dealing with another country. He can't just ignore the Philippine government, because the Philippine government is on the way to becoming the government of an independent country in just a very few years at this point. So this now poses the problem. If you were these Hawaii commanders, suppose you wanted to do some serious reconnaissance. Now, I'm referring here to a very interesting little book. It's called Defenseless. Defenseless Command Failure at Pearl Harbor by John W. Lambert, Lambert, and Norman Polmar. And this comes from smaller publisher, I believe, Motor Books International in St. Paul, Minnesota. So this is the story of the Bergquist thesis, right? Bergquist is a guy, army officer, dragged into the Pearl Harbor Commission, called upon to testify. And he says, I was building a filter room, and the Navy in particular would not send me liaison officers because Kimmel simply did not understand what the filter room was. Because the thing about the filter room is all information goes in, and that's got to be the basis for command decisions that are made in the filter room. So you need more than just a liaison. You need to have a high-powered officer there who can take part in making those decisions. So that's Bergquist. Now, these guys are also telling you the story of the U.S. 7th Air Force, the Pineapples, the Hawaiian Air Force. And these are in some ways the unsung heroes. And we'll get to them in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we're just reviewing this book, Defenseless, which is the story of how a Dowding type, this is Air Marshal Dowding, his type of filter room and air defense center, aircraft warning system, was not installed, even though they had orders to do it, and all of the stuff, including the radar, had been delivered. So we have negligence by Kimmel and by Short. And the other irony is that this system the Dowding system owed quite a bit to General Claire Chennault, right, leader of the Flying Tigers. He was the director of the air defense for the Republic of China, the Chinese nationalists, the Chiang Kai-shek people in China when they were getting bombed by the Japanese. And what Chennault would do is he had spotters, right? He had a ground observer corps that would report to him, sometimes by telephone, but more often by things like signal fires or flags or God knows what. They would relay the word in that the Japanese were coming. Notice this big difference. Chennault has confidence in the Chinese people to provide him with accurate information. You look at Short, and Short says, the main issue is that these Japanese Americans are subversives, and they're going to come and sabotage the airplanes. You can get the difference, right? It's the difference between an open attitude where you're going to cooperate with people, including in other countries, right? The Chinese. And then Short, who has this idea that somehow you can't trust those Japanese, right? They're all subversives and so forth. So for that reason, he had his airplanes parked wingtip to wingtip on the airfield, and this is part of the tragedy. Chenault had done air defense drills where he'd say, if I can't have anything, I'm going to have two guys with binoculars standing back to back on the top of a water tower, and we'll see what's coming somehow. So you want to see what's coming. What can you do? How do you get more input? Right? You got your radar. Run the radar. Take it seriously. Don't ignore the radar warning, which is what happened with the lack of such a filter center. Right? Don't ignore the warning from a destroyer coming into the harbor where they say we just sank a Japanese midget submarine. But what do you do from a naval point of view? Well, you can send submarines. You send a picket line of submarines 400 or 500 miles out, and you can see a whole lot. And you'll probably get some benefit out of that. You want to intersperse those quite likely with destroyers who can see and probably not be seen by these much bigger vessels. Kimmel was explicitly told by the Navy Department to get some sampans, fishing boats. So you might say, well, what can that do? Well, the Soviets used the trawlers, right? Remember in the Cold War. And the sampan only has to be a yacht or a boat with a radio on it, and it can see things, and it can then it can relay warnings. And that's the way the Doolittle raid was discovered, right? Just a few months later, the Japanese had a picket line of sampans and fishing boats, and that was enough to discover the Doolittle raiders and alert Japan. Now, what they did with it later was a different story, but the alert was provided. Then there are some other ones that we tend to forget about today. The light the light cruiser. Light cruiser is sometimes called a scout cruiser. It's very fast, it's very light, and it has at least one or sometimes two planes on it, float planes that can be catapulted. So they can go up and fly off several hundred miles in either direction. So you get a lot of mileage out of light cruisers. Another one, a seaplane tender. What is that? Seaplane tender is like a freighter. It's got seaplanes on board. It can hoist them off the deck, put them in the water. They take off. They fly around. They come back. It's like having a small aircraft carrier, especially good for this sort of picket duty. And there are all sorts of other variations on this. The other one to bear in mind is the air reconnaissance. Everybody knows the PBY Catalinas, two-engine planes, very reliable, very capable, a bit slow, poorly armed, but nevertheless, just the thing. And the argument coming from the Army in particular was, we need 180 B-17s. And if we don't get 180 B-17s, we can't do anything. So they say it's got to be a complete search or no search at all. Now, everybody knew the Japanese were coming from the northern quadrant. So if you were trying to defend, what you'd want to do is to send quite a few of the PBYs and other planes to this northern quadrant, right, sort of around north by northwest, which is where the Japanese then came. And this was known going back to the 1920s. The reason for it was that you couldn't get near Pearl Harbor without being noticed unless you went through the relatively empty expanses of the North Pacific. So they kept saying no, right? They had a bunch of B-17s. They had almost 10 of them. They could have sent those out. There's also something called the B-18. The B-18, despite the name, is an older, less capable, two-engined bomber. But they said, no, those are no good. Now, the Royal Canadian Air Force used the BOLOs, these were called the B-18s, for anti-submarine warfare all through World War II. And, of course, after the blow, right, by 11 a.m. on December 7th, right, after the Japanese had done the damage and left, then the Navy and the Air Force were able to have a joint search with 5 B-17s, 3 B-18s, 13 PBYs, and then, a couple of dozen of other aircraft, 46 in all. That was what was left. They had 60 or 70 PBYs in advance. They had dozens of these B-18s. They could have done all that. So what are you left with? You're going to blame Roosevelt for the fact that these people were so rigid and so pedantic? And, of course, it can be worse because the people involved, these officers, generally were not favorable to Roosevelt. I think we can say, based on some of the stuff that has been preserved, there's one where the head of the Navy, this is somewhat earlier, right, about a year before, the head of the Navy goes to the White House and says to Roosevelt, we naval officers don't have confidence in your administration. And the implication, of course, is you're a communist and you have Harry Hopkins and he's a communist and we don't like what you're doing. And, of course, Roosevelt found a way to fire the guy, but that's what you were dealing with, a rather impudent display of a disgruntled officer, right? So things that provides very interesting context for all sorts of things. So this I think would be the verdict on the first part. Now, the first part being, what is the responsibility of Kimmel and Short? They did not search. They did not defend. And these pineapple guys, the Army guys of the Hawaiian Air Force, are the ones who took it on the chin. If you've seen that recent Pearl Harbor movie, you've probably seen the attempt to get Army planes off the ground in the midst of the attack and how many people get killed who didn't need to get killed. And so they feel that the commanders let them down because they had 150 fighter planes that could